The dinner party, where everyone had a reason to hate him. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. You're cordially invited to celebrate James's promotion to senior partner at Morrison and Associates. Saturday evening, 7 o'clock. Black tie optional. What the invitation didn't mention was that every single guest had been carefully selected for one very specific reason. They all had personal scores to settle with my husband. My name is Dr. Helen Morrison, and for 6 months, I'd been planning what would appear to be the perfect celebration dinner for my husband's career milestone. 12 guests, 5 courses, and an evening that would demonstrate exactly what happened when you spent 15 years systematically betraying the trust of everyone around you. What James didn't know was that his promotion wasn't the only thing being celebrated that night. I was hosting a masterclass in collective justice, where each guest would contribute their own chapter to the story of why James Morrison deserved everything that was about to happen to him. James thought he was attending a dinner party, honoring his professional success while surrounded by friends and colleagues who admired his achievements. What he was actually walking into was the most elegant revenge symposium ever orchestrated, one where every guest had been personally wronged by the guest of honor, and every course would serve up a different variety of consequences. Picture this: a restored Victorian mansion in Boston's Beacon Hill, where I'd spend my mornings reviewing psychiatric case notes while planning the most psychologically sophisticated dinner party of my career. As a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in analyzing antisocial behavior patterns, I understood exactly how to design social situations that would reveal someone's true character under pressure. For 15 years, I'd watched James charm his way through our social and professional circles while systematically betraying the trust of nearly everyone he encountered. He was brilliant at compartmentalizing his deceptions, ensuring that his victims never compared notes or realized the scope of his manipulative behavior. But James had made one crucial error in his pattern of betrayal. He'd consistently underestimated the intelligence and memory of the people he'd wronged. Each manipulation he thought he'd gotten away with had actually created a potential ally in my growing understanding of who my husband really was. The guest list for James's celebration dinner had been curated with the precision of a clinical study. Each person invited had been personally betrayed by James in ways that had caused significant professional, financial, or emotional damage. Most importantly, each guest was unaware that their individual experiences were part of a much larger pattern. Guest number 1, Margaret Sinclair, James's former law partner, whom he'd systematically excluded from major client relationships before forcing her out of the firm they'd built together. She'd lost her practice, her financial security, and her professional reputation because of James's strategic manipulation. Guest number 2, Dr. Richard Chen, a brilliant surgeon whose medical malpractice insurance case James had sabotaged to benefit a competing client. Richard had faced professional investigation and nearly lost his surgical privileges because James had withheld crucial evidence that would have exonerated him. Guest number 3, Sarah Williams, James's former secretary, who'd been fired and blacklisted from legal employment after discovering James's systematic billing fraud. She'd been scapegoated for crimes she'd tried to report, losing her career and facing financial ruin to protect James's reputation. Each guest represented a different category of James's betrayal: professional sabotage, financial fraud, career destruction, personal manipulation. Together, they formed a comprehensive portrait of a man who'd built his success by systematically destroying anyone who threatened his advancement or discovered his unethical behavior. But the most sophisticated aspect of my guest list was that I'd structured the dinner to encourage natural conversation flow that would gradually reveal the connections between everyone's experiences. Each guest thought they were attending a social dinner with people they'd never met. not realizing they were all survivors of the same predator. James thought he was being honored by friends and colleagues who respected his achievements. What he was actually facing was a carefully orchestrated intervention where 12 people who'd been personally wronged by him would finally understand that their individual suffering was part of a systematic pattern of abuse. I'd spent months preparing for this evening with the same attention to detail I applied to complex forensic evaluations. By the time dessert was served, James would understand exactly what it felt like to be surrounded by people who knew the truth about his character and had finally found their collective voice. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect autumn night in Boston. Our dining room had been transformed into a setting worthy of Architectural Digest. Crystal chandeliers, antique china, and floral arrangements that would have impressed the most sophisticated hostess in Beacon Hill society. The first guests arrived at precisely 7 o'clock, each bringing the kind of practiced social grace that successful professionals develop for navigating high-stakes social situations. What they didn't realize was that their host had specifically chosen them for skills that went far beyond dinner party conversation. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet Dr. Richard Chen," I said, orchestrating introductions with the precision of a conductor arranging a symphony. "Richard is a cardiovascular surgeon at Mass General. Margaret is one of Boston's most accomplished attorneys, or was, until she decided to pursue other opportunities." Other opportunities was the polite way of describing how James had systematically destroyed Margaret's legal career. Richard, being a surgeon who understood the impact of professional sabotage, immediately picked up on the underlying tension in Margaret's response. "It's interesting how career transitions happen," Richard replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd faced his own professional challenges. "Sometimes external factors force us to reevaluate everything we've built." "Yes, especially when those external factors involve people you trusted completely," Margaret responded, her eyes flicking toward James, who was holding court with other guests across the room. By 8 o'clock, the cocktail hour had established exactly the dynamic I'd hoped for. Each guest was beginning to sense that others in the room shared similar experiences with betrayal and professional sabotage, though they hadn't yet identified the common denominator. "Helen has outdone herself tonight," James announced to the group, raising his champagne glass. "It means everything to have friends and colleagues here to celebrate this milestone. Success is so much sweeter when shared with people who truly understand the journey." The silence that followed James's toast was telling. Several guests exchanged glances that suggested they understood his journey better than he realized, and had very different opinions about the methods he'd used to achieve his success. Dinner, bell chiming. "Ladies and gentlemen, dinner is served," I announced, directing everyone toward the dining room where place cards had been arranged to ensure maximum conversational chemistry between guests with complementary grievances against James. I'd positioned James at the head of the table, surrounded by people whose lives he'd damaged in ways he'd assumed they'd never connect or discuss. Margaret sat to his right, Dr. Chen to his left, with Sarah Williams directly across from him, where she could observe his reactions to conversations that would gradually reveal the scope of his betrayals. The first course was served with elegant efficiency, while conversation flowed naturally toward topics that would gradually expose the connections between everyone's experiences with professional betrayal, legal manipulation, and career sabotage. What James didn't realize was that he wasn't just enjoying dinner with accomplished professionals. He was sitting at the center of a carefully orchestrated support group for his own victims, one that would help each guest understand that their individual suffering was part of a much larger pattern of systematic abuse. The conversation shift happened during the second course, as I'd carefully orchestrated. Margaret was discussing challenges in the legal profession when Dr. Chen mentioned his own experience with professional investigations based on incomplete information. You know, it's fascinating how often crucial evidence disappears or gets withheld during professional investigations, Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. I've seen cases where attorneys deliberately sabotage their colleagues by manipulating information flow. That's exactly what happened to me, Richard replied, setting down his fork. My malpractice case should have been straightforward. I had documentation proving the hospital's equipment failure caused the surgical complication. But somehow, that evidence never made it to the investigation committee. Your attorney withheld exonerating evidence? Margaret asked, her professional instincts engaged. Not just withheld, actively suppressed it to benefit his other client, the hospital's insurance company. I nearly lost my surgical privileges because my own lawyer was working against me. Richard, surely you're not suggesting deliberate misconduct. Sometimes evidence gets misplaced during complex proceedings. No, evidence doesn't get misplaced. It gets deliberately hidden by attorneys who prioritize profitable clients over ethical obligations. I've seen it happen. Sarah Williams, who'd been listening carefully from across the table, leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd found kindred spirits. I used to work for an attorney who systematically defrauded clients through false billing and evidence manipulation. When I tried to report it, I was fired and blacklisted from legal employment. He made sure I could never work in law again. What was your attorney's name, Sarah? James Morrison. I was his secretary for 3 years before I discovered he was stealing from clients and hiding evidence in cases like yours. The silence that followed was deafening. Every guest slowly turned to look at James, who'd gone pale as he realized that his carefully compartmentalized victims had finally found each other. Sarah, that's completely unfair. You were terminated for legitimate performance issues, not because of any alleged... James Morrison? You're James Morrison? The same James Morrison who stole my client list and forced me out of our partnership by manipulating our financial statements? What followed was a symphony of recognition, as guest after guest began connecting their individual experiences with the man sitting at the head of my table. The investment advisor he'd defrauded, the witness he'd intimidated, the judge he'd attempted to bribe, the clients he'd stolen. Each person finally understanding that their betrayal was part of a systematic pattern spanning 15 years. I sat at the foot of the table, watching James's face as he realized that his wife hadn't just invited random colleagues to celebrate his promotion. I'd assembled a prosecution team of his own victims, each one now armed with the knowledge that they weren't alone in their experiences. Helen, what is this? What have you done? What I've done, James, is exactly what any good forensic psychiatrist does. I've gathered all the evidence needed to demonstrate a clear pattern of antisocial behavior. Every person at this table has been personally victimized by your systematic manipulation and betrayal. The only question now is what they choose to do with this information, and whether you understand that your career celebration just became your professional funeral. What happened next was beautiful in its spontaneous organization. Without any coordination from me, James's victims began naturally structuring their revelations like a formal proceeding, with each person presenting their case against him in chronological order. Margaret, with her legal training, naturally took the lead in organizing the presentations. If we're going to do this properly, let's establish a clear record. James, you're facing allegations from 12 people spanning 15 years of professional misconduct. Each of us will present our case, and then we'll discuss collective action. This is insane! You can't turn my dinner party into some kind of kangaroo court. You systematically destroyed our careers and livelihoods. The least you can do is listen to the consequences of your actions. One by one, Each guest presented their experience with James's betrayal. The financial fraud, the evidence tampering, the witness intimidation, the client theft. A comprehensive catalog of professional misconduct that painted an undeniable picture of systematic criminal behavior. James destroyed my career for trying to report his billing fraud. I lost my apartment, my savings, everything, because I tried to do the right thing. He convinced me to invest my retirement savings in a development project that he knew was fraudulent. I lost $200,000 because I trusted someone I thought was my friend. James Morrison attempted to bribe me during the Patterson custody case. When I refused, he filed false ethics complaints that required 6 months of investigation to resolve. Each testimony added another layer to the portrait of a man who'd built his entire career on betraying the trust of everyone around him. What made it even more devastating was that James couldn't deny any of the allegations. Every guest had documentation, witnesses, and evidence that supported their claims. What we're seeing here is a textbook case of antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features, I explained to the group with clinical precision. James has spent 15 years systematically exploiting everyone who trusted him, believing that his compartmentalized approach would prevent his victims from ever comparing experiences. But antisocial behavior patterns always eventually collapse under their own weight. Tonight, James is facing the collective consequences of every betrayal he thought he'd gotten away with. The question now is how we proceed. James has committed actionable offenses against each of us. We can pursue individual cases, or we can coordinate a comprehensive complaint that demonstrates the pattern of his misconduct. What amazed me was how quickly James's victims organized themselves into an effective prosecution team. Margaret provided legal expertise, Dr. Chen offered professional credibility, Sarah had inside knowledge of James's methods, and the other guests contributed their own specialized skills and documentation. Helen, please. You're my wife. We can work this out privately. These people don't understand. What these people understand, James, is exactly who you really are. And what I understand is that I've been married to a predator who spent 15 years destroying innocent people while I looked the other way. Your promotion celebration just became your resignation party, and these people are going to make sure you never have the opportunity to victimize anyone else again. By 10 o'clock, James's victims had organized themselves into the most effective prosecution team I'd ever witnessed. Each person contributed their expertise to ensure that James would face comprehensive consequences for 15 years of systematic misconduct. Margaret drafted a formal complaint to the State Bar Association that outlined James's pattern of professional misconduct, supported by testimony from multiple victims and extensive documentation. The complaint was so comprehensive that disbarment was virtually guaranteed. Dr. Chen contacted the district attorney's office to report the criminal aspects of James's behavior: evidence tampering, witness intimidation, bribery attempts, and fraud. As a respected surgeon, his testimony carried significant weight with prosecutors. Sarah provided insider documentation of James's billing fraud, client deception, and evidence manipulation that she'd secretly preserved when she was fired. Her records would support criminal charges that could result in significant prison time. But the most devastating aspect wasn't the legal consequences, it was the social and professional ostracism that followed. By midnight, word had spread throughout Boston's legal community that James Morrison's career had imploded spectacularly during his own celebration dinner. Helen, what do you want from me? What will it take to make this stop? What I want, James, is for you to face the consequences of 15 years of systematic betrayal. What I want is for your victims to finally get justice. And what I want is for you to understand that some dinner parties are planned by people who understand exactly how to serve revenge at the perfect temperature. Sound of guests departing with purpose. The guests left that evening not as strangers who'd shared an awkward dinner, but as allies who'd found each other and their collective voice. They'd exchanged contact information, shared legal resources, and coordinated their efforts to ensure James would face maximum consequences for his crimes. I stood in my empty dining room, surrounded by the remnants of the most successful dinner party I'd ever hosted. The crystal glasses still sparkled, the china remained elegant, and the floral arrangements continued to perfume the air with their beauty. But the most beautiful element wasn't the decor. It was the justice that had finally been served to a man who'd spent 15 years believing he could betray anyone without consequences. 6 months after the dinner party that ended James's career, I was reviewing the quarterly reports for my expanded forensic psychiatry practice from my new office overlooking Boston Common. The publicity from James's case had brought national attention to my work analyzing antisocial behavior patterns in professional settings. James had been disbarred, convicted of multiple felonies, and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. More importantly, every person he'd victimized had received restitution and the satisfaction of seeing their abuser face comprehensive consequences for his crimes. Margaret had rebuilt her legal practice with the support of colleagues who'd learned the truth about why she'd originally left the profession. Dr. Chen had been completely exonerated and was now serving on the hospital's ethics board. Sarah had found new employment and was pursuing her law degree to become an advocate for whistleblowers. The dinner party had become a case study in collective victim advocacy that was being taught in law schools and psychology programs across the country. My technique of bringing together an abuser's victims to share their experiences had proven remarkably effective for both healing and legal prosecution. I'd also been invited to speak at conferences about using social psychology principles to expose patterns of professional misconduct. The Morrison method had become a recognized approach for helping institutional predators' victims find their collective voice. The man who'd thought he could systematically betray everyone around him had discovered exactly what happened when his victims finally understood they weren't alone. James had spent 15 years compartmentalizing his abuse, believing that his victims would never compare notes or organize against him. What he'd learned was that some dinner parties are designed by forensic psychiatrists who understand exactly how to create social situations that reveal truth, encourage healing, and deliver justice with elegant precision. I'd hosted a celebration dinner where everyone had a reason to hate him. By the end of the evening, they'd all found their reasons to ensure he'd never hurt anyone else again. Sometimes the best revenge isn't personal. It's providing a platform where justice can be served collectively, beautifully, and with the kind of systematic precision that ensures the consequences match the crimes. The dinner party, where everyone had a reason to hate him, became the night when everyone finally got their reason to see justice served. And trust me, I was exceptionally good at planning menus that left everyone satisfied.